Okay, so here's everything you need for that New York Times best-selling novel. I've got all the lore, the layout, everything you should need to bring it off. Mr. Torrance leafed through the notebook, shaking his head as he blew out a long breath. Thomas, this is amazing. Why aren't you using these ideas? You've sold me so many fantasy novels. Why not cash in yourself? Thomas snorted into his macchiato. What's wrong, Mr. T? You tired of being on the bestseller list? No, God, no, but... The old guy thought about it for a minute before answering. Why not publish these yourself? Why sell them to me? Thomas shrugged. Honestly, I don't have the drive to sit down and turn them all into novels. I like coming up with the concepts and writing the lore, but whenever I try to write them down, I get bored and just come up with more concepts. They're better in your hands, man. Mr. Torrance looked to see if he was joking, and shook his head as he took out his checkbook and wrote Thomas the agreed-upon sum. I swear, Thomas, you might be the best writer who doesn't write I've ever met. Thomas smiled and put the check in his wallet. Thanks. Tell your friends. He was still smiling when he walked out of the bank an hour later, the bills paid for the next 4 months, and all for a couple of hours of work. Torrance would write another book and go on talk shows and sign autographs, and Thomas would pay his bills, go on dates, and generally live his life. There were people out there who would have been angry at this, but not Thomas. Thomas had seen what the spotlight does to people, and he didn't want it. Thomas O'Hare, son of Jack O'Hare, had seen the devastation of rising to the top. As a child, he had told his father endless stories about knights and elves, spacemen and terrible aliens, about haunted houses and mysterious lands, and his father had soaked it all up like a sponge. Jack O'Hare had been a middling writer, a struggling columnist, and a mediocre father, but Thomas had loved sitting in his study, telling him stories. That's great, Tommy boy, his father would say, writing and writing and writing, as his son told him tales of everything and anything. When his father had written Watchtower, a story about the knights who manned the watchtowers of Elise and protected them from the dragons and elves that roamed the desert, he'd made a cool 90,000 off it, and another 50 for the rights to the short miniseries. Thomas remembered watching it on TV and was happy that his daddy had brought his story to life. By the time he was 15, Thomas began to understand what was going on. His father had written a book a year since he was 4, sold ideas and multiple pitches to producers, and they had come up in the world quite a bit. Thomas was also aware that his mother suspected that the visits to writers' conventions were an excuse to sleep with strange women in new cities. She had caught him at it more than once, the partners usually young enough to remember high school, but Thomas's father always said the same thing. Go on then, Maggie, leave me. Take the boy and whatever the court decides you get and live in some shitty little apartment with a shitty little car and a shitty little life. I'm making the big bucks here, and you want to be with the man who makes the big bucks, 'cause he buys the good stuff. Do you really think Tommy is going to want to live in some rundown shack when he can stay with me in luxury? Keep dreaming. She had stayed, but Thomas hadn't. His father had raged when he told him. By then, he'd been into a habit that was eating up his savings quicker than he could pitch ideas. But Thomas said his ideas had dried up. He didn't have anything for his old man, and as the money ran out, so had all the rest. No more talk shows, no more book signings, no more conventions, and certainly no more 20-somethings sniffing around for scraps. The fortunes of Jack O'Hare had dwindled, but Thomas's were just starting to build. His father had fallen into obscurity, and Thomas had begun selling his ideas to people who would appreciate them, and the one writing them. He'd put his poor mother up somewhere after he'd convinced her to leave his father in the pit that he'd dug for himself, and now he only heard from his dear old dad in the slowly deteriorating voicemails he left him. Thomas wasn't sorry for what he'd done. His father was a leech, and eventually, leeches got squished. "Hey T, you got that?" "Right here, Ray," Thomas said, tossing him a thumb drive. "That's all the research, sources, and footnotes you'll need for your thesis." Raymond cackled, pumping his fist as he jumped the back of the couch and landed beside Thomas. "T, how do you do this? You're like a genie or something. I just make a wish and sim sim salabim," he intoned and extended his fingers. "Like magic." Thomas shrugged as he made a disgusted noise. This was the 4th time he had tried to kill this boss, and he was getting a little tired of dying. "I don't know, Ray. It's like a mutant superpower or something. I always just know what people need. Stories, information, whatever. They need it, I have it. They pay for it, and I provide it." "Speaking of," Raymond said, taking out his wallet, but Thomas put a hand out. "Not for you, Ray. Taking your money would be like eating your leftovers. Satisfying, but not wholly helpful." Ray chuckled. "And the fact that once I get my doctorate, I'll be making enough to pay for our apartment 3 times over has nothing to do with this?" "It might. I'm sure I can't keep this up forever, and I might need someone in high places to help me out someday." Raymond took the controller from him as he died again. "Don't worry about that, T. You know I've always got your back," he said, killing the boss fairly easily before handing it back to Thomas. Thomas reflected that it had always been like that with them. He and Raymond had known each other since elementary school, and they had felt drawn together in a way that he couldn't explain. Thomas needed Raymond to ground him, and Raymond needed Thomas to give him stability. Thomas always seemed to have the resources that Ray needed to succeed, and Raymond had the drive and the ambition that Thomas seemed to be missing. Raymond would go places, Thomas knew, and Thomas would follow because he liked to watch Raymond soar. When Thomas had left home at 16 so he didn't have to watch his father's decline, Raymond's family had been more than happy to take him in. When Raymond needed help getting into med school, Thomas had helped him with his tuition. The two were there for each other, always had been, and Thomas saw no reason for it to stop now. His phone vibrated, and he hit pause as he pulled it out and checked the message. "Tomorrow at 2 at Jilly Beans." "That's not ominous or anything," Raymond said, glancing over his shoulder. "It's just business. It's nothing illegal, as you know." Raymond shook his head. "True, but it never gets any less weird." Thomas smiled as he continued his quest through the bleak landscapes of Dark Souls 2. Raymond wasn't wrong, but damn, was it lucrative. Thomas arrived early, got himself a coffee, and took a seat in the booth by the wall where he usually sat. Jilly Beans was one of his usual spots, and the owner nodded at him as they locked eyes. He liked it here. The ambience was very old school, and Thomas enjoyed smelling the grinding beans, hearing the machines as they brewed, and listening to the chatter around him. He pulled his phone out and let the buyer know that he was here, making some notes on his phone about a new idea that he'd had on the way. Pirates, a mysterious island, sunken ships, ghost fleets, and a treasure beneath the waves. It had Summer Blockbuster written all over it. He looked up as someone took a seat, grimacing as he looked back down at his phone just as fast. "I'm meeting someone. If you want to buy ideas, you'll have to make an appointment." "I'm afraid your client won't be arriving," said the fellow in the tailored suit, his sleek black hair held under a bowler hat, which he sat on the table. "Oh, and why might that be?" "Because we made them a better deal in exchange for when and where they were meeting you. You, as it happens, are a hard man to track down, Thomas O'Hare." Thomas was a little startled that the man knew his name, but he hid it well. "You've gone through a lot of trouble to find me. I'm guessing you're, what, IRS, feds? I can assure you that all my money is made legally, and I'm not paying taxes on it. I make it through my own sweat and efforts, so you can—" No, Mr. O'Hare. I work for someone who is, let's say, morally gray, but even we aren't that evil. No, I represent someone who has a mutual interest in your enterprise." Thomas lifted an eyebrow. "I didn't know what I had was an enterprise." "Oh, yes. Quite a lucrative one, actually," said the young man in the suit. "And I suppose you and your boss are looking to invest, is that it?" "Quite the contrary. We'd like you to stop." Thomas blinked at him. What? To stop, to cease, to end what you're doing. You see, my employer has been doing it for a very long time, and you are encroaching on his business. Thomas looked at him for a few seconds before he started to chuckle. He expected the kid would pick it up, but no such luck. He just sat there, smiling politely, waiting for Thomas to get it out. You're joking, right? This is a joke, right? The man shook his head. Afraid not. My employer is very serious. Look, I don't know who your employer is, Mr. Lucifer, the man said, and Thomas's eyes got very big. No, not that one. Lucifer T. Jones, acquisitions officer for Libris Talent. We acquire talent from those who cannot utilize it properly, but we also sell that talent to those in need of it. You're selling the fruits of your talent, something we simply can't have. We will be very happy to pay you for your talent, but you monopolizing such a vast talent in this way is unacceptable. Thomas gave Lucifer a skeptical look. And if I decide not to sell it to you? Lucifer went right on smiling, but it was less friendly than it had been. Well then, we would have no choice but to lean on you, disrupt your business, make things very difficult for you. Thomas scoffed, getting up as he glowered at Lucifer. Good luck with that. I sell ideas, sir, and the need for ideas is always high. Lucifer pulled a hand out of his pocket so quickly that Thomas almost saw the gun he expected to be there. There was no way. Was this well-dressed man just going to blow him away right here in Jilly Beans? It was unthinkable. He'd never get away with it. Was his boss this serious about profit margins? He had slitted his eyes, waiting for the pain, but when he opened them, he saw the business card in the young man's hand, a startling cream color against his dark skin. In case you change your mind, a talent like yours would be at a premium, to be sure. Thomas walked off without taking the card, but found it later in his wallet. Whoever this Lucifer Jones was, he was more than met the eye. Mr. Sorrels, you told me you were looking for fantasy? The man was not one of his usual clients, but Thomas couldn't turn down business. He had several fantasy drafts that would grow into novels worth a mint, and if Mr. Sorrels had the cash, Thomas had the ideas. Sorrels, for his part, looked like someone interested in something different. He was sweaty, very shaky, and did a lot of smiling. Yeah, definitely. What kind of novels do you have? Well, I have this. It's called The Kingdom of Elwith. It's a marriage intrigue about... Yeah, that sounds great. Hey, let's walk a bit as we talk. It's hard to hear you in here, and I want all the details before I make my decision. Thomas looked around, growing a little wary of the man and his shaky smile. Ground Level, another of his favorite coffee shops, was mostly empty, and the noise was at an acceptable level. Why did this guy want to stroll and talk? It was likely to be louder on the sidewalk than in here. Something wasn't adding up here, and Thomas didn't like it. Look, Mr. Sorrels, if you want the material, then it's $3,500, non-negotiable. My work generally brings in 10 times what I charge, and this one has real potential. I'm sure you've heard about my previous clients and the quality of my stories. So, do we have a deal or not? Mr. Sorrels kept looking at the door, his smile looking sickly, and when Thomas glanced that way, he felt like someone was watching from across the street. It wasn't the smiling Lucifer Jones either. This man was corpsey, a man-thing in a tailored suit, and his eyes were flinty as it smiled that rictus of a grin. I just don't know. That's a lot of money, and I think we should talk about it more. The weather's so nice, But Thomas had heard enough. He got up, and to his surprise, the man grabbed his arm. It was more like a request than a demand, but Thomas pulled away and practically ran for the door. This wasn't his normal sale, and he didn't like the feel of it. The guy was trying to lure him off, and Suddenly Thomas wanted nothing so much as to be back in the safety of his apartment, with the door locked and the world kept at bay. "Wait!" the man said shrilly, but Thomas was already away. The specter was gone, but as he went home, Thomas felt eyes on him nonetheless. It was something he would become used to in the coming weeks. Thomas was walking home that night when a van pulled slowly along behind him. His hands were full of groceries, just a few things for the house, and he was shaking his head as he thought about the weirdo at ground level. What the hell had that been about? He'd had guys try to stiff him on payment, bounce their checks on purpose, or what have you, but Sorrels had almost tried to grab him. What had he hoped to accomplish, Thomas wondered. Had Lucifer put some kind of bounty on his head? And what if he had? The money couldn't have been worth getting caught, and Thomas couldn't imagine a talent company would be that interested in him. The van was pulling up next to him, and Thomas turned to look just as the yawning mouth of the van's side door slid open, and hands reached out for him. They weren't even bothering with masks, and the faces he saw didn't exactly look like the kind of fellows who snatched people off the street. They were pale, disheveled, and looked a lot like Sorrels had. He would have thought them junkies, but he'd worked with writers long enough to know the look. These were academics, not kidnappers, but the hands that reached out to take hold of him were strong and determined, nonetheless. Thomas swung his grocery bag at them, breaking the pasta sauce and rupturing his milk as he fought them off. They fell back, not expecting his barrage of foodstuffs, and as they did, Thomas took off. The van screeched to life, but he was cutting down a shortcut before they could catch up to him. His adrenaline was up, and Thomas was showing his heels. He didn't stop until the door was secure behind him, and when it was, he crumpled into a ball, his fear coursing through him like a drug. Thomas swung his eyes from side to side, looking more like a scared deer than his usual self. The last 2 weeks had been a nightmare that Thomas was unable to wake up from. It hadn't ended with the attempted kidnapping from the van. Most of his clients had either stopped answering or seemed far too interested in meeting him. Their messages were not the ones he'd received before, and they were full of empty platitudes and strange desires to meet in places Thomas didn't usually meet his clients. After the incident at ground level, Thomas was hesitant to meet people, and his business suffered because of it. He'd felt hunted when he left the apartment, and not just by people on the street. The eyes of that strange cadaverous thing seemed to follow him, and Thomas was beginning to think that this might be the benefactor that Lucifer Jones had spoken of. So he stopped going out. Thomas had plenty of funds. He didn't need to sell for a while. He could just wait for this to blow over. It was no big deal. It would end soon, and he could return to business as usual. Then, today, Raymond texted him and said he had left his books at home. "Hey, left my chem book at home. Can you bring them to the chem lab for me by 6? Thanks, man." The message was fairly mundane. Thomas wouldn't have risked it, but Ray was close to graduation, and he needed to keep his grades up if he was going to get his doctorate. Every face on the street seemed more menacing than the last, and Thomas kept his head down and his cap pulled low as he approached the university. In and out, quick and easy. Then he could get back to the apartment and lock all the locks and feel better in his mind. He would be safe there. He was always safe there. And as he entered the Heisman building, he made his way to the chem lab. He was nearly there, the door in sight, when a familiar voice called out to him. "T, what are you doing here?" Thomas exhaled in relief. "There you are. Here, I got your chem book like you asked for." Raymond seemed confused. "Thanks, but chem isn't till Thursday." "You sent me a text and said you needed it," Thomas said, glancing back at the lab door and only now noticing that only the emergency lights were on inside. "Nope. In fact, I lost my phone earlier. I haven't sent any texts all day. Must have been a wrong number, bud. Sorry." Thomas felt his breath quicken. If he looked carefully, he thought he could see the shadows against the wall. What were they planning to do? Were they going to take him to the Shadow Man? To turn him in for some kind of reward? What the hell was this? Thomas had never felt so pursued in his entire life, and he didn't like it. T, you okay? He jumped when Raymond touched his shoulder, but he nodded hastily. God, they had stolen Ray's phone. They could have just as easily hurt him, but they hadn't. It seemed they hadn't become that desperate. Yet. Would they stop with the phone next? Would they hurt Raymond to get to him? If they kidnapped Thomas, then would they really stop it? I gotta go, Thomas said, rushing off as he ignored Ray's calls from behind him. He had the business card out before he hit the sidewalk, the numbers tripping over themselves as he dialed. Mr. O'Hare, said the smooth voice of Lucifer Jones. We've been waiting for you. Meet me at Jilly Beans in 30 minutes. I don't want to be accosted by anyone either. I know you have something to do with this, and if it will put an end to it, then I'm willing to deal. Of course. I'll be there in 30 minutes, but I think it might be better if I met you somewhere safer, somewhere you would feel secure. Your apartment, maybe. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his neck, feeling the eyes on him already. They were hungry, and they knew there would be something to gain from taking him now. Would they try to grab him right here on the street? Thomas didn't know, but he suspected the prize was grand enough to make them sloppy. Fine, 30 minutes at my apartment. Don't be late, or the deal's off. As he hung up, he heard several phones chirp all at once. He was running again, figuring Lucifer had let them know the deal was off. He wanted to be far away before they decided the deal might be back on if they went ahead and grabbed him. He wanted to be well away before they found their nerve. Unsurprisingly, Lucifer was waiting for him when he arrived. I assumed you wanted to get this over with. Shall we? Thomas opened the door, and despite wanting to slam it in his face, he let Lucifer Jones into his sanctuary. I'm glad you came to your senses. We wouldn't want any unpleasantness over this. What do I need to do? Thomas said, not in the mood for veiled threats or pleasantries. Just sign your name here, Lucifer said, taking out a thick leather book and opening it to the front page, and it will all be over. The book was thick, old, bound in what could have been leather or human skin. Thomas couldn't explain it, but the book felt like it was watching him. It was a hateful old thing, the kind of book that Faust had signed, he was sure, and he didn't like the sight of it on his coffee table any more than he liked the man holding it in his apartment. And this is what? Thomas said, shuddering a little as he looked at the book. A contract, a very special one. Sign this, and all your troubles go away. We pay you for your talent, and you never have to worry about us, ever again. Thomas felt his hand freeze as he took up the pen. What was he doing? If he couldn't sell his ideas, he would just be one more person, grinding themselves down a little at a time. He had money saved, but it wouldn't last. He couldn't do this. There had to be another way. He thought of Raymond, though, and that made it easier. Besides, he thought, as he signed the book, he could always find a way around this. He still had his ideas, and that was what mattered. To his surprise, the pen went right on moving across the page. It wrote out the story he had been preparing to sell that day at the coffee shop, all of it in a matter of minutes, and moved on to another. The pages turned, drinking his words, and Thomas was helpless to stop it. What the hell? What is this? Your talent, Lucifer said, and it will make quite an addition to our catalog. The pen took it all, the fantasy, the sci-fi, the horror, the noir, everything. It felt like days passed as the sun darkened and lightened behind the windows of his living room. His hand cramped, his fingers crabbed, but he wrote on. The book grew fangs and terrible eyes, and still he wrote. It took it all, every word, and before he blacked out, the image of Lucifer Jones and his predatory smile were engraved across his psyche forever. Raymond came home that night and found him collapsed on the couch and took him to the hospital. Thomas woke up 3 days later to find an IV in his arm and a worried Raymond by his side. "You scared me," he said, hugging him as if to make sure he was real. "What the hell happened?" "Dunno," Thomas lied hoarsely, but one look at his bank account told him all he needed to know. His lost talent had made him a several times millionaire overnight, but his biggest surprise was still to come. As Thomas lay on the couch weeks later, watching some drivel on television, he winced as a spark shot through his mind. It was a thought, an idea, and he grabbed his phone and took notes. Whatever Lucifer had done hadn't taken everything. They had got his ideas, his trade goods, but they hadn't drained the well. The ideas were rusty, nothing to brag about, but they were a start. Thomas had a seed, and he knew that in time, his garden might grow again. And this time, I won't be so quick to sell it, he promised, smiling as the ideas began to take root again. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our Spooky Ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our Spooky Skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. My time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.